Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our LaRouche PAC strategic overview. Tonight, I'll be joined by Barbara Boyd, and this discussion is a call to action and a mobilization call. As many of you know, LaRouche PAC has just introduced a very important campaign and initiative with our petition to stop the prosecution of Donald Trump, the prosecutions against Trump. And this comes with our support of a piece of legislation that was introduced by Representative Matt Gaetz. And we will go into the importance and implications of this petition, why it needs to be. We are really encouraging and demanding that everyone sign the petition, spread it far and wide. I'm going to pull it up here in just a second. What we're going to discuss tonight, Barbara is going to go through what the prosecutions are about in detail, who the prosecutors are, what Matt Gaetz has called for, Representative Gaetz, is to use the power of the purse to defund Special Prosecutor Jack Smith. And the petition also focuses on the need for the impeachment of Merrick Garland. And we'll go through, Barbara's going to go through why this is important in the context of the fight for President Trump's Agenda 47, what this means in securing the victory in 2024, saving our republic, and stopping this, not just stopping the witch hunt against Trump and stopping the Biden crime family, but why this stopping of this prosecutional, the attacks against Trump with these continuous prosecutions is so important in this context. So in that context, Barbara is also going to discuss how this pertains to ending the insane war in Ukraine and what Trump stands for in that context, and discussing the real economy and what's happening with the staggering economy. So I'm going to turn it over to her in just a second. But before I do, I want to show people where the petition is. I know this is already going up on social media accounts. It's already going up and getting major attention amongst MAGA groups and many others. Anybody who understands that the censorship and the role that is being played by this apparatus who has been targeting not just Trump, but the American people has to be stopped now. So let me pull this up quickly here. And all right, here we go. So this is the petition. As it says here, petition, stop the prosecution of Donald J. Trump now. And you can sign here. The petition, as stated, has called for mobilizing a mass movement and revolt to this insanity coming from the American people and the population, and making demands on the Congress that this is the most important target and focus we can be having right now. And so as we state here, it not only talks about stopping the prosecutions against of Donald Trump against Trump, it also talks about why this is important, because what President Trump is doing as the only candidate who has endorsed the American system of political economy, an economy whose advanced manufacturing, advanced energy sources, and modern infrastructure platform ensures the pursuit of happiness for every American and his or her posterity. I think this is very important to focus on what we're fighting for, how we put an end to this oligarchy attack on our republic by going after the leading political candidate. As we know, every single day we're seeing President Trump is out leading every single one of his political opponents and candidates. So this is where you sign the petition, and it tells you what's going to be done with it, how it's going to be delivered, and further mobilization you can do with this petition. So as I said, this is a call to action tonight, and we're going to let Barbara go ahead and give us further implications of why this is so important and why everyone should get behind it. Let me get her on here. There we go. Go ahead, Barbara.
Hi, everybody. So I took a look last week at where the overall sort of battle stood, in terms of what President Trump has rightly characterized as the last great battle, the last great chance we have to save our republic. And it's very important to step back and really think about that. The way that you're bombarded by the news media is to think of everything sort of as emerging separate issues. We have the issue of transgender ideology. We have the issue of child trafficking. We have the issue of fentanyl killing, at this point, somewhere near 350,000 Americans between, just in the last 3 years, which is more than the actual combat deaths in World War II. Just take that in for a second. We have the open border. We have the prosecutions of Trump. We have the corruption of the Biden family. We have the war in Ukraine. Somehow all of those things are seen as separate issues, separate fronts, when the reality is there is one grouping, the offshore modern British financial empire, its central bankers, and it's bought and paid for politicians who have orchestrated, the demise of the United States ever since August of 1971, when we left the gold standard and began this transition from a manufacturing economy into a service economy and into something in which many people were completely left out. In fact, the vast majority of the American population was completely left out. Now, Trump came in and he interrupted all of that. All of the tension which people feel about Trump, all of the stuff that goes on of why did he fight and why is there so much tension around him, and isn't there too much chaos, and aren't we under too much stress with this guy, etc. Think about it for a second. That's really a product of the fact that you're living through the turbulent change of an entire system, or his effort to do such in his first administration. He came in and he basically kicked over the entire chessboard of the last 30 to 40 years of American foreign policy by going back to the idea that nation states, sovereign nation states, should actually collaborate with one another and be in one-to-one relationships with one another, rather than in service of a globalist international financial empire. That's kickover number one. He turned around the whole way that the economy was being run and insisted that we needed to bring back manufacturing and industry and major, industrial sources. He then said, let's go to space again. Let's ignite the imaginations of our young people. Let's actually do something like Kennedy did in terms of going on a great national adventure. And, all of these things are what caused the oligarchy to go completely friggin' nuts. Now, they're not separate issues, therefore, that we're looking at. We're looking at a very deliberate policy set into motion. Open borders essentially is to service an economy which leaves out most of the population, leaves them in low-wage jobs, leaves immigrants basically in a slavish society. What you've got coming up right now is their answer to Trump. Just 1 second. Let me take care of my barking corgi for 1 second. Sorry, folks, but dogs, as you know, sometimes don't really pay attention to what their alleged masters are doing, and that's sort of what's happening right now. At any rate, what we've been through from the Mueller investigation, from Russiagate, if you just think about the sequence, the way I tell the story, it's like a whole bunch of crimes were committed in Russiagate. We now know that to be overwhelmingly true. for the first time in American history, really, the entire Justice Department went after the major presidential candidate on the Republican side. It wasn't the first time it's happened in history that a presidential candidate was gone after. Lyndon LaRouche sort of set the precedent for that. But essentially what happened is that for really the first time in Russiagate, we saw the full weight of the intelligence community and the United States government and the British government all mobilized to actually stop Trump's candidacy. This story, however, really begins, and I'm going to tell the story in a little bit out of order, back in 2014 in Ukraine, because the overwhelming foreign policy apparatus that Trump interrupted with his idea about a different kind of foreign policy was a foreign policy which was very much through British intelligence sources aimed at creating a war with Russia, preventing any alliance between Russia and China and India and the United States at that point, which could have been an alliance, as LaRouche pointed out, which could have overthrown the whole British financial empire at that particular point in time. So all of the foreign policy goals of the Obama administration were to be carried forward by Hillary Clinton, and Trump interrupted that entire framework. In Ukraine in 2014, the United States and the British ran a coup. But it wasn't just a coup in terms of a color revolution in the normal sense. What was set up was a offshore drug money, all sorts of billions and billions of dollars running through that country through illegal activities, gigantic corruption, everybody, not just the Bidens getting a payoff. And the guy who was appointed to actually be the czar of Ukraine after that coup d'etat was a guy by the name of Joe Biden. That's very, very important in tracing the history which we're now seeing of the Biden corruption scandal. Fast forward, and as soon as Russiagate ended with all of its crimes and criminality against Trump, what did you get? You got essentially the first Trump impeachment hearing. What was that about? Well, Trump said, why should we be sending all of these missiles and all of this money and all of this other stuff to this corrupt country? And not only that, my ear to the ground, I've heard something about the fact that Joe Biden is personally profiting off of the relationships he built up starting in 2014 and through his son in this Burisma company and through the various oil and gas deals, which Biden had gotten himself a stake in as vice president during the whole business with Ukraine as it started. So there's a whole backdrop to this story, which has been partially told, but keeps getting shut off in terms of its full implications. We would not be in the war with Ukraine right now if Trump had won, Trump had been seated, but if he had been seated as the president of the United States in 2020. The reason why we're in that war with Ukraine is that the delayed attack on Russia, which would have been carried forward by Hillary Clinton at that point in time and was interrupted by Donald Trump, took place as planned and had been being planned for by the British and NATO and everybody else, took place under Biden. That's why Trump keeps saying it would not have happened under me. He knows the full story. But remember, the very first time he raised that issue in a telephone call with the new president, the then new president Zelensky, boom, all of a sudden, everybody was in an uproar, and we had our first impeachment trial, which was a very dirty business. And the whistleblower in that trial, whose name I still can't say without actually, getting us censored on YouTube, was a character who used to be the CIA agent assigned to Joe Biden in the White House as vice president. So you see, there's a lot here beyond the simple corruption, which the Republicans are talking about now around the Biden family corruption. That's why there's a move on, in part, by Kevin McCarthy and others to do away with both impeachments. So that's kind of the Ukraine war side of this thing, why Trump is absolutely right. He's not saying certain things, which I'm quite certain he knows about the situation in the Biden family. But more significantly, it's much, much broader than that. It involves the entire foreign policy apparatus of the United States, the intelligence community, the so-called deep state, and what their stakes were in this actual battle to defeat Donald Trump and take him out of the picture. So then we fast forward, and what happens is these guys are determined not to let Trump actually win the 2020 election. We have COVID. We also have an insurrection, an actual insurrection in the streets of the United States throughout 2020. There's a virtual army which is gathered and deployed and will be deployed if Trump wins and is seated, or is able to be seated because he wins by such an overwhelming margin in 2020. The whole plan there, and it's open, it's been discussed, but it's not being discussed right now in terms of what's at stake here. The plan was to have the military come in and actually remove Trump from office if he was to be seated for a second term. That's all been out in the open. There was a whole thing called the Transition Integrity Project. All the people behind these prosecutions now were part and parcel of that attempted idea for a coup d'etat if Trump was actually seated as the next president, which shows you the insanity of these prosecutions, because 3 of them are centered around the election. I can't say that famous word or I'll get censored on YouTube, but it's centered around the election and centered around the electors and centered around, Trump's attempt to rescue the American Republic by actually showing people what actually happened in the election and what the plan was to actually subvert not just his presidency, but the entire electoral apparatus of the United States. So what are these prosecutions at this point? We've got one in New York, which is this crazy thing of essentially going after the Stormy Daniels alleged payoff for sex crimes. That thing is total BS, but nonetheless, it's moving ahead and it's presently scheduled for trial in March of 2024. It's a crazy indictment. It's been slammed in the press appropriately. It's being brought by a state prosecutor, Albert Bragg, who ran for election and said, my primary goal in reaching office is going to be to jail Donald J. Trump. He ran for election on precisely that framework. And as a result, the jury pool in Manhattan, which is where this will be tried, is highly suspect and highly corrupt. Although, as you can see, we're moving that the petition in New York State saying essentially we want the New York State legislature also to defund Bragg's prosecution. And Republicans have shown a remarkable capacity within New York State over the last period. Remember, Lee Zeldin almost won the election for governor of New York, came very, very close in the 2022 elections in the midterms. So the issue is you have a jury pool in Manhattan, which is by far the stronghold of the Democrats. But there's every indication that if you were to organize the entirety of the state and get a national movement going around this thing and actually get a genuine anti-war impulse going in the Democratic Party, an anti-censorship impulse going in the Democratic Party, and also a real American system view of the economy whereby the working class and the middle class would not continue to be slaughtered by this service economy and by all the craziness which has taken place in the deindustrialization of the nation, we have a good chance of actually changing the prospect of that particular indictment. Next up, at least on the calendar, is this crazy Florida Mar-a-Lago documents case. I call it the overdue library card case, the mad librarian case, where the people at the National Archives, a heavily Democratic bastion, went nuts over the packing which was done at the White House of records that were taken down to Mar-a-Lago. And you have the thug division of the United States Department of Justice, the really heavy thug division, i.e. the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, the very same people who ran Russiagate, involved in actually prosecuting Trump under the Espionage Act, a 1917 statute meant to quash anti-war dissent for the First World War, the same statute that they're trying to prosecute Julian Assange under. They're now saying that the President of the United States, is guilty of espionage somehow against the United States, when the President of the United States is the lead classification authority. He can declassify anything that he wants to declassify. And not only that, the National Records Act, which actually deals with these presidential records, says that he can take whatever he wants, and then the National Archives and he engage in a civil suit, if it comes to that, over what belongs to them and what belongs to him as a presidential record. So it's a completely novel approach to the Espionage Act. And what will happen is that they're going to say that there's all sorts of classified records here. There's all sorts of possible damage or potential damage to, quote unquote, the national defense of the United States. And they're going to charge him primarily with obstruction of justice and claim that, somehow he tried to hide these things from the snoops who came down there to actually take those records back to the mad librarians, as I call them, at the National Archives. So that thing has presently been scheduled for the 24th of May. So you got two big criminal trials right in the center of the presidential primary season for 2024. Now what's happened is a third, front is being opened by this creep, Jack Smith, who is going to come in and essentially indict Trump, he's saying at this point, for January 6th, and for, what he claims is the false electoral schemes of Trump to try and hold on to the presidency when in reality, according to what Smith will try and prove, Trump didn't really believe his claims that the election was stolen. They're going to use 3 statutes to try and make that case, or at least that's what they've alerted Trump to. One of them is the obstruction statute, a very strange construction of it. It's a new part of the obstruction statute, which was actually set up under Sarbanes-Oxley after the 2008 financial collapse to deal more with corporate corruption and corporate fraud. And somehow they've twisted that statute now to bring it around and make it apply to a protest against a congressional certification of the vote, which, there have been protests against the Electoral College and the congressional certification of the vote ever since Bush versus Gore, and going even backwards, further than that, back to Kennedy versus Nixon. So this is indeed a completely novel, again, use of the law, never been done before, completely off the wall. Then they're going to try and actually, for literally political narrative purposes, claim that somehow Trump's actions on January 6th and before fall under the civil rights statute, the private part of the civil rights statute, 18 USC 241, something which I'm pretty familiar with by trying to litigate the civil rights statute against various private conspiracies that we encountered in our time within the LaRouche movement. But the reason why they're picking that statute is because of its name. It's called the Ku Klux Klan Act. All right, so let that one sink in. They're going to basically create a narrative which says, for people who only read headlines, that Donald Trump has been charged under the Ku Klux Klan Act. And you can see, in terms of everything we now know how this stuff works, how that one is going to be played. Then they're talking about simply what's called a Klein conspiracy statute, or fraud against the government somehow. That's a very springy statute. It's what Lyndon LaRouche was indicted under for his alleged tax offenses. And it's a favorite tool of Justice Department prosecutors because it actually has the impact of lowering the burden of proof in criminal trials whenever it is actually used. So into this calendar in 2024, we're now going to insert another prosecution for 2024. And then on top of that, we have a prosecution which is scheduled to drop in Georgia sometime in August. And this is a prosecutor by the name of Fannie T. Willis. And she, like Alvin Bragg, did exactly the same thing. She ran for office with a specific campaign promise in Atlanta that my job, and you're voting for me because what I'm going to do is I'm going to indict and jail Donald Trump. That's my campaign promise. From a prosecutor who's supposed to be, quote unquote, a servant of the law. Not that we have anything, but we're going to find it. So there you see how they're planning to have Donald Trump spend his time when he is the leading candidate right now, topping all polls for President of the United States in 2024. The whole purpose here is not to have him on the campaign trail, but to have him on trial and to generate headline after headline after headline after headline, as we saw in Russiagate, to literally brainwash the population in such a way that either they succumb in their view to that type of narrative control, or they recruit enough crazy people that if he wins and actually takes power, will have violence in the streets of the United States like you've never seen. That is their strategy. And what's going on right now in the House of Representatives is these guys were elected precisely by people to stop this, to stop the entire Biden agenda and to stop the prosecution of Donald Trump. And right now, they're contending with two different forces. They're contending with the base of the Republican Party, the population in the United States, which is uniformly saying, stop this. We're going to lose our country over this. If you continue it, it's a coup. Stop it. Figure out how to stop it. And the other side, where enormous pressure is being put, and the theme is, if we can prove Biden family corruption and sort of, get rid of Biden without supporting Trump, without stopping this stuff on Trump, won't that be enough for the Republican Party to survive in kind of its olden form without Trump? Those are the two contending pressures which are going on right now that I see, that I think are going forward. It's unclear whether Biden is even going to, run for president the next time around. He's running now, but the war in Ukraine is an abject failure. There's no way that they're going to be able to actually rescue that. It is a genocidal slaughter of the Ukrainian people brought on by the fact that both the British and the United States refused to allow the Ukrainians to negotiate their way out of this thing. It's horrible, and it's going to come back to actually haunt the Democrats in terms of 2024 if we can tell the story the right kind of way. So we want to basically kick butt, to put it lightly, at this point in terms of Congress, and say, flip the channel, Charlie. You've talked about impeachment of Garland, Kevin McCarthy. You've talked about wiping out the 2 Trump impeachments and hearings, which of course go right to J6 and go right to the election. If you do all of those things, if you start impeachment hearings against Garland, if you defund Jack Smith using the Holman rule and the defunding mechanisms of the appropriations rule, if you actually go ahead and do what you're talking about doing in terms of expunging the 2 Trump impeachments, and you hold the appropriate hearings where you lay before the American public exactly why all of this stuff happened, what the international stakes were, what the plans were that Trump disrupted, what the plans are that a continued Trump presidency would disrupt right now, the fact that we could have a United States which actually gets reindustrialized, we could have a United States which ends the killing of our next generation, the literal wipeout through drug addiction and fentanyl poisoning. We could have a United States in which, once again, as happened after Kennedy's great challenge for the moonshot, where kids, instead of thinking about their gender or whether they're victims of gender dysphoria, are putting together rocket ships and figuring out how to actually go to the stars, which is what I spent my youth doing because of John F. Kennedy's challenge to go to space. You're going to have a complete transformation of the culture. And right now, the American people are rejecting all of this. We just need to get it organized in a focused way and actually send people, send the message to Congress. This is what must be done when you come back in September from your August recess. This is what you must organize yourselves to do. And you have to lay before the American people exactly what the real stakes are and the real issues are in this entire battle. So that was my motivation for putting this initiative together and thinking about it. Overall, I think our goal should be to just penetrate the entirety of the Republican and independent apparatus that supports Donald Trump at this point over the next 2-3 weeks. And then what I want to do with the petition is I want to start to move the offensive, both from a literal offensive standpoint in terms of policy, into the Democratic and independent layers, which they think are theirs and which we're going to capture to actually end and make an actual counter-revolution of our own in this country for the good. So that's how I'll end my remarks, and of course I'll take any questions which people have.